Thank you so much for coming. Sorry to put a hush on the crowd. My name is Joe Fitzgerald Rodriguez. I'm a journalist, formerly with this nice outfit, KQED, most recently. I'm the president of our Society of Professional Journalists Northern California chapter. Woo! And I'd love to welcome you to Behind the Headlines with all these wonderful journalists who are here to talk to you about everything that they do to get public records from government agencies. But first, I just wanted to set you all up with all the people who brought us here. I wanted to thank the First Amendment Coalition, the sponsor of tonight, SPJ NorCal, our group, the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, who kindly gave us a grant for all of this, and the Bay City News Network. Those guys are great. A little bit about SPJ just before we start. Just wanted to let you know a little bit what we do because, even being journalists, we're not that great at telling other people what we do, communications. We help young journalists with mentorships, bring them up. We give workshops like this to help mid-career journalists and citizen journalists and everyone else. We're really open with what they do. So hopefully, if you have an idea or you'd like to host a workshop, I'd love for you to reach out. If you have some skills you'd like to share with your fellow journalists or with the community. We also have a satellite chapter in San Quentin, a prison, which is pretty cool. These are some awesome journalists who, yes, are incarcerated persons, but some of them are extremely well published. Some folks in San Quentin are Pulitzer Prize winners. and we like to go in there and offer mentorship. So if anyone is interested in mentoring at San Quentin Prison, and we're also expanding possibly into other prisons. We're in conversations with one about 2 hours south of San Francisco. Please let us know. It is extremely rewarding to go into those spaces and give that kind of help. And lastly, we like to offer our best defense of journalists in the Bay Area and Northern California, which is the stretch of our where we call home. When Brian Carmody had police officers knocking down his door to get his confidential sources, we were his first call. And of course, the First Amendment Coalition was there for him like crazy as well. We try to be there for you. So if you have need for us, if you're dealing with government agencies and they're giving you the runaround and or they are infringing on your rights, that is what we're here for. Now, we don't, events like this, no one carded you to say, are you a member of FAC or SPJ? This is open to all. But if you want to become a member, we do have sign-up sheets over there by the refreshments. Please check them out. We hope that you become a member and try to give what we do. And if not, no big deal. We have these events open to everyone. And I just wanted to, one point of clarification, we are putting this on Zoom. This is a hybrid thing. So everyone on the Zoom call can also hear you. And this is being recorded for other folks to learn from what's going on today. Not to put you all on the spot. The cameras are all pointing that way, don't worry. But they can hear you. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And can we just get a round of applause for Joe? He does this as a volunteer job. Thank you, Joe. Joe's a great co-conspirator. He's my unindicted co-conspirator one for so much education and advocacy. So I'm Ginny Leroux. I'm the advocacy director with the First Amendment Coalition, your friendly neighborhood open government lunatics. We've been doing this across California for more than 30 years. We defend free speech, a free press, and the people's right to know. And as part of that, we do these educational programs, and we have great partners. Thank you. I also just want to thank Bay City News. I know our board president, Kat Rollins, is tuning in from Canada via Zoom. So I just want to say hello and thank you for your support, inviting so many of your colleagues and interns who I saw come through the door. And I want to give a special thank you to the student journalists, your advisors and editors who got word out and who are here. Welcome, student journalists. Hello, and interns. It's so great to see you in person. So let me introduce you to the stars of today. I'm going to help facilitate, but really what this is about is learning from journalists on the beat. I was a career reporter, editor, covering cops and courts, and so fighting some of these fights by myself was no fun. So I tried to create a training program here that is like what I would have wanted when I was on the beat, which means bringing together people from different beats, different publications to talk about their experiences so we can all learn from them. So today, we have Julia Love. Julia is a technology reporter for Bloomberg News. She's been a foreign correspondent in Mexico City for Reuters. She's been on the technology beat at the Mercury News and covering federal courts, including the Ninth Circuit, for the Recorder, a legal affairs newspaper. Welcome, Julia. Julia will be taking us behind the headline of a tremendous story about law enforcement sweeping up data from Google about all of us. Next, we have Holly McDeed. Holly is working right here at KQED most recently. You've also seen her bylined in the Richmond Side and in Vallejo Sun, and before that at KALW. Holly is also working on her master's in journalism at UC Berkeley. Thank you for being here, Holly. Holly will be taking us behind the headlines on reporting on teacher misconduct. Okay, and we also have my colleague, Annie Capetta. Annie is not your lawyer, but she is your favorite lawyer. I can tell you that right now. Annie is a fellow at the First Amendment Coalition. She's been practicing in California now over a year. She represents journalists in their public records cases and a First Amendment case right now. And she also helps anyone in California who has a question about open government through our free legal hotline, which she'll tell you a little bit about. Annie, thank you for being here. And we also have Candace Wen, who I'm going to make go first tonight. And I think we have a couple slides we can get going. Candace is with NBC Bay Area. She's an investigative reporter. And I had to write down her accolades because these are awards that some of us have never even applied for. So Candace is on a tear right now. She has received a nomination for Emmys. She's received the Sidney Hillman Award. She's received an Edward R. Murrow, which is a big deal in broadcasting. And she's also volunteering her time with the Freedom of Information Coalition, the Freedom of Information Committee of SBJ NorCal. That is a committee that Joe is co-chair of, that does so much to support public records advocacy. And Candace volunteers her time, which means giving back through the James Madison Awards program, which I hope you all will participate in the future. Candace is going to take us behind the headlines of 911 hanging on the line, a story that anyone can relate to if you've ever been on the public safety beat or covered a city or a county. And with that, I would say, let's get going. You've prepared a great presentation for us. Yay.
Don't hype it up too much. Thank you so much for that. So 911, it is in all of your communities, all of your counties. They're all locally controlled, and each one its own individuals can be its own individual story. And I say that because Oakland PD has its own 911 center. Oakland Fire Department has their own 911 center. Why are there so many 911 centers in California? There are 440. That's a long story in itself. Well, decades ago, the feds say, hey, if you have a 911 center, we'll give you money. And suddenly like, we have a 911 center. We have a 911 center. And there are plus and minuses of whether having so many is a good thing. And anyways, that's a whole nother thing. But today I'm going to walk you through how through public data, we uncover that Oakland PD's 911 center has had the worst 911 answering time out of any city or county in California, and how through additional public records, that local story turned into a statewide story and then a national story with just a web of follow-ups. And I really hope you look into 911 centers where you are, because like us, you might find that it's just simply a gold mine of stories. So our reporting started exactly a year ago, not exactly, almost a year, over a year ago. We started in June 2023. On our tip line, I started getting calls from people as well as 911 dispatch managers saying, hey, here in Oakland, it's taking a long time for 911 calls to be answered. Even the mayor and police officers' own 911 calls were getting busy signals. So I thought to myself, well, what is a long time? Like, maybe glitches happen. Well, we looked up that the average answering time should be within 15 seconds. That's both a state and a national standard. Okay, so we're getting somewhere. This is where I'm starting. So next slide. The next step I took, being the super fancy and experienced reporter, investigator that I am, I Googled. I Googled to see, okay, Oakland 911 problems. Well, it didn't take a lot of effort to find these two civil grand jury reports that showed that Oakland's 911 center had had problems for a long time, for years. I mean, even though this one says 2019 to 2020, it was covering 2018. And why I found that interesting, just in case they're like, hey, this is because of the pandemic, all that. Well, no, you were having problems before the pandemic. So what's going on? These reports here went into painful detail about just how bad the 911 center was. And, the next slide here, I want to show you an example. It'll show that Oakland PD is forced to buy replacement parts on eBay. That's how old some of their 911 technology is, and CAD, computer aided dispatch. Also, at this time, they only had one technician who still knows how to work the 20-year-old software. So I read this and I was like, well, is this like an article out of The Onion? And is this report really old? No, it wasn't old. This was from like last year at that time, 2022. I literally went to my boss's office and I was like, can you believe this? So I thought, this is so egregious. Oakland must be fixing this problem, right? Well, wrong. And I found that out by contacting these Oakland officials, many of whom, I think all of them, maybe, I'm not sure about Patty Navalta. There's been some turnover in Mayor Sheng Tao's administration, but I found this out, that at that time, things weren't being fixed because I started just calling and emailing and submitting inquiries like, hey, what's going on with Oakland 911? And what really struck me after calling and emailing these offices was that there was zero urgency. They told me that this had been a problem for a long time, long before their administration, long before they had gotten their jobs, that this was nothing new and it was the norm. And you know what? In a way, they were correct. People in Oakland were telling me, yeah, I've lived here for decades. 911 kind of never worked. And I took a step back for a second because that's outrageous. We are taught as children, you call 911 when there is an emergency. And so if that's, just to share a little personal story here, I don't live there now, but I was born and raised in Oakland. In the 3rd grade, my dad passed away of an aneurysm overnight. My mom was 32, called 911 with me and my brother sleeping in a bunk bed in the next room. And I thought about, when my mom called 911, if she had gotten the busy signal, that is unimaginable that you add an ounce of more trauma in an already traumatic experience. And with the state of the 911 center still to this day in Oakland, this is outrageous. And the lackluster response by some of these officials in their offices made me think we have an even bigger story here. So now getting to why we're here today, I'm going to talk about the public records. I filed public records to find out the lay of the land right now. So what were the Oakland 911 answering times right now? Oakland, if you, and I'm sure many of you are, filed a public records request with the city of Oakland. They're kind of behind. They have a huge backlog that has been a whole story in itself. And so I figured, okay, who else is Oakland reporting to? Who else has this data? And, who else are 911 centers across California? Who are they reporting their data to? It would be the California Office of Emergency Services. I filed a similar request. It's right there. You can see average answering time, 911 calls. I filed the same request with this agency. And then several weeks later, we got the data from the state. And this was great. It really showed like the number of 911 calls each 911 center was getting, ring time, hold time, talk time. And then if you look at the next slide, I really want to show you how things got super interesting for us. So data showed that out of the 440 911 centers across California, the vast majority of them were answering their 911 calls within the 15-second standard. Okay. It showed that Oakland PD was a huge outlier. A huge outlier we saw that through their average answering time was 54 seconds, nearly a minute long, which is nearly 4 times that 15-second standard. In this next clip I'm about to show you, you're going to hear from people in Oakland we started talking to at this point who told me they wished their 911 call was answered in 54 seconds, that they were actually waiting 10, 15, even 20 minutes.
Hi, 6th and Jefferson, a police officer just got stabbed by a homeless person.
The profusely bleeding officer used his cell phone to call 911, and his repeated calls failed to connect.
Okay, they're not waiting for the ambulance. Okay.
An ambulance never made it to the Oakland police officer who was stabbed. He was just 2 blocks away from police headquarters.
So when I call 911, usually you're on hold for approximately 10 minutes.
He found a crushed body in his tow yard, and this happened.
I called the police so they could help me, but they didn't answer.
Ringing, ringing, nobody answering. I couldn't get through. It's a busy signal and it just hangs you up.
So the facts here were so egregious. We kept
Can I
the
ask
elements
number
pretty
15?
simple to put it together. And this is kind of speaking from the broadcast side. So obviously there's a story, right? And to back up just a bit, a lot of people have been reporting on Oakland 911 times being bad. That was nothing new. But what we set out to do is, why is it bad and why has it not been fixed? So the next things I did, we needed more records to tell the story. So how do you get records when the 911 call was not answered? Well, these aren't records, but we got interviews with those people. They're going to be impactful interviews, literally worst moment of their life, 911 wasn't answered. I made sure to check their phone records to see how long they waited or with their phone companies, video of the incident. And of course, I would try to verify the incident with law enforcement, even though we don't know about the 911 call, verify like the car accident did happen. There was a medical emergency to vet it, because everyone was like, how do you vet something that the call never went through? But that's sort of what we did there. So for those 911 recordings, when eventually the 911 call went through, so you got that person who's like, finally, someone's answering the phone, to get those recordings that really help bring life to our stories, whether it's for print to use as quotes or in broadcasts or in podcasts. These are some of the things I've learned. When you public records request a 911 audio recording or computer-aided dispatch log that shows you like kind of what happened, request it sooner, the better. For 911 audio, a lot of agencies, sometimes they re-record every month and they're like, oh yeah, that existed last week, doesn't exist anymore. Sooner, the better. I also found, at least with Oakland PD, if you find an incident has an incident number, let's say it's a big fire and all these people were calling 911 and allegedly OPD or the fire or the agency didn't respond, ask for the incident number 21 dash blah, 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 blah. That's really helpful because I public record request that and they gave me all the 911 audio related to that incident. So I didn't have to go to individual ones. Let's say the incident only involved a couple people. So like a family member called 911 because mom was having a medical emergency, caller's name, phone number, as much detail as possible, this address and all that. And I've gotten lucky and gotten some 911 audio there as well. So, okay, so we are at this point a couple stories in. After getting these elements, we just start putting the stories together, airing them. Oakland was still mostly ignoring me, you know, not to waste any time, even though I was hoping to do an interview with the mayor, but they were not granting that. So I went looking for the agency that oversaw them, wondering, what is the state agency thinking about this? Are they even aware of what's going on in Oakland? So the state agency spokesperson, we're not gonna play this just yet. This is him. He agreed to speak with me. Around this time, what was interesting, Oakland's data finally did come. Remember, I got the data from the state, but now much longer. Maybe they're like, oh, you aired a couple stories. Okay, here's the information you need. Who knows? I never know the reason, but I finally got Oakland's data on their 911 answering times. And I found huge issues with that. Not like you didn't need for example, there was one year where in the month of March, they said they had 0 911 calls. I'm like, well, all right, okay. Or like the data, like they said, oh, they answered calls at this time in this month. And then the state saying the data was a much different number. So in this interview with the state, I asked, well, how do you even monitor a 911 center if you're getting inconsistent information at the very least and inaccurate information. So this is when we started turning the corner, showing our process to our viewers and holding officials accountable.
As part of our role in the government is to closely monitor what's happening all across the state.
If you don't have accurate data, what's at stake?
Everything. Public safety, knowing what's happening in the field, to the public, to your loved one on the street. Decisions are so often made by data.
But what is Cal OES doing to enforce proper reporting?
So we have some ability to to push and pull as a service function. But ultimately, that's going to come down to locals.
Then what's the point of a mandate or a standard if time and time again it is not met or enforced?
There is follow-up that's needed, it sounds like, in order to make sure that folks get the support they need.
I usually don't like getting into the weeds of bringing people like, oh, this data didn't make sense. And you usually want to sort that out and then tell the story. But this data that had so many holes in it, we made it as part of the story. And we actually used the data that we got and the gaps in it, and it became part of the story. So 2 weeks after that interview you saw, the state sent Oakland a notice to improve their 911 times. So I'll get to this in just a second. But so 2 weeks after that interview, some impact, some action by the state saying, hey, Oakland, you guys, within 1 year, you need to fix your 911 times or face some penalties. After that interview, that spokesperson also never spoke to me ever again. I don't officially know why, but I do wonder if it had something to do with what you're seeing in this slide and the fact that we also reported in that story that this state agency is supposed to do regular reviews of every 911 center at least every other year. Remember, there are 440, right? So at least every other year. After my story, they changed it to once every 5 years. I don't think that solves the problem that you just push the deadline. But anyways, you're supposed to regularly monitor, do fiscal and operational reviews of 911 centers. Well, take a look at 2024. And I pulled this in May. They did 0. Last year, they did 22. The year before, 2 and 0. And if we show the next slide, I thought this was even more outrageous because taxpayers and every California phone user, everyone in this room, so every month if you check your bill, you pay a 30-cent 911 surcharge. So that goes to like maintaining our 911 systems. It also goes towards supporting 911 centers. But you can see that we're pouring a record amount of taxes and fees, and it really went up after 2018, 2019. So this became a bigger story at this point, definitely a statewide story. So in the next report, I only have a second to scratch the surface, but I wanted to show you this next slide because I encourage you. So especially if you're in California, in this link here, every state has to tell the FCC, this is how our 911 system works. So if you go to this link, and you press California, or if you're listening, especially everyone joining us virtually, you're another part of the state. If you go to your state and download this 911 fee report from these states, it answers these questions. It's a survey. How many 911 centers are in your state? How much is 911 costing? So I actually used those fee reports to create that graph that we saw. So I took those fee reports off the year and I just made that line graph. How many 911 voice calls are you getting a year? Because maybe they're saying, oh, our 911 answering times are bad because we're getting so many more calls this year. Well, are they? You can look at these 911 fee reports. How many text to 911 messages? That's a relatively new thing that states are doing. And this is my favorite. It really just shows the structure of a state's 911 system, so you can find out who's in charge. If you do find egregious issues with 911 in your state, and it's time to hold someone or a system accountable, usually these reports will explain that. Okay, so let's get back to Oakland. What is Oakland saying about everything we're finding? We're at this point like 5 or 6 stories into Oakland 911, still silence from the mayor. And at this point, I'm looking for her next public appearance. I never want to be that reporter who kind of does what we call unscheduled interviews. But with these kind of stories that demand answers from people in charge, going to a public press conference and saying, hey, I've been trying to get these answers is completely fair. So as I was preparing to do that, well, what do you know? A press conference. And here's what happens.
unit to all of these Oakland officials after more than 2 months of unanswered emails and calls from the investigative unit to all of these Oakland officials about the dire state of the city's 911 system. A major announcement Monday.
Thanks to additional revenues collected this year, we are able to direct an additional $2.5 million over the next 2 years to strengthen our 911 response.
Will these changes bring down the 911 answering times in Oakland? And if they will, when?
Absolutely. You know, everything that we're working towards is to really bring down that and closing that gap.
Help me understand, why did you freeze a full-time dispatcher position in your latest city budget?
That position was actually a HR situation that happened. And so it actually did not impact at all any of the call services.
Yeah, after our investigations, as well as 2 civil grand jury reports, City Council member Janani Ramachandran did a deep dive into Oakland's 911 dispatcher hiring process. She is telling us now she found Oakland's Human Resources Department failed to process dispatcher applications for an entire year.
So I added that part for 2 reasons. One, so this entire time, Oakland officials have been doing press conferences telling me, saying, hey, one big reason for this is that there's a national dispatcher shortage. That is true. But also, we found out, as you just heard, that Oakland's HR department had so many vacancies that they did receive 1,000 dispatcher applications, people who wanted to work as dispatchers, but the city never processed them. So that is, and I wanted to add that this only came to light because an Oakland City Council member filed her own public records request to get this information. I believe she saw some of our reporting and she filed, why would a staff member file the PRA request? Well, she told me it was because she was not satisfied with the information she was getting from staff and staff reports. So she filed the public records request. And maybe you can chime in, because if you file, she said, if I file a public records request, there's more obligations. She got more complete information. So it's very troubling that a staff member has to do that, but she found this out.
So I'd sat with your city council member Source at the James Madison. Yes, at the Freedom of, but Annie, answer this. What she said is, I have so much more appreciation and respect for what you all in this room do every day, because it is not easy submitting a records request to any California agency. And she was like, it wasn't a cakewalk for me either. But she thought it was such an important, transparency issue. I mean, Annie.
Yeah. So the Public Records Act allows any member of the public, in state, out of state, anyone, to submit a public records request, including people on the governing board of the local agencies that they're requesting. And again, no matter who's submitting that request, that kicks in the legal obligations under the PRA, which are going to be stronger than just trying to informally ask staff members for things, because there's a deadline for their initial response. The initial response has to tell you whether they have records or claim exemptions. And yeah, they have all kinds of obligations that we can talk about throughout the presentation. But yeah, anyone can submit, and then the agency is subject to the PRA requirements.
And then to quickly wrap up my portion of, I just have a couple more things. So it was public records and the tips that we got that 1 year later, we have now done like 16 stories on 911 in Oakland, and we're far from done. Also, we did a story on Oakland buying new technology to update their 911 system, but failed to install it for 5 years. And they were supposed to install it in August. I'll check one more time if it's been installed, but they've kept saying, oh, it'll be 6 months. I was like, you said that 6 months ago. A big one here, if you dig into text to 911, we found out that text to 911 can't find you as quickly as calling 911, and that really people who are deaf or people who need to call for help silently, this really impacts them. Next slide. All these stories help prompt, and all these records help prompt meaningful action. The state putting Oakland on notice, giving them 1 year to fix their 911 times. Oakland didn't make that deadline. We did that story recently. Again, confirming through public records. Oakland investing $2.5 million into 911. We're right now still fighting for records of how did you spend that? Where are the receipts? Where's the financial accounting for that? They hired an HR director, started streamlining hiring, and the first time in 20 years, the mayor is saying they're starting to turn the corner, which of course we're verifying that statement through public records. And my takeaways, quick ones here, is just persistence, persistence, persistence. In the next slide. And look, in your areas, if you find out 911's not working properly, it's a story. If you're finding out it's not being fixed, it's a bigger story. And when you get overwhelmed by these stories, just take it one at a time. All right. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, Candace. We're going to go on to our next presentation. So we're going to hold Q&A to the end. We built in some extra time for Q&A, but we did want to get through all three reporters' presentations, and then you can just grill them. And we also have some experts in the room, some very experienced investigative reporters who we may put on the spot to give us their own tips and takeaways or frustrations, depending on the mood. So my takeaways from your reporting, Candace, is who's the watchdog? Is the state the watchdog? Is the FCC? You're the watchdog. Journalists are the watchdog of our 911 call centers, just like so much else. That's a timeless story. Investigating a 911 call center was the first investigative story I got put on in the years redacted, but it was decades ago. And same story, same problems, another part of the country. So my challenge to you is if you're a local reporter or you're a reporter looking for a local story, look into the 911 call center, look into staffing, look into the technology, look into where they're spending the money. Now, the big crisis is are the texts working? Is the community safe by going that way? 20 years ago, it was, should we be able to accept cell phone calls to 911, right? So there's always something to look into and make sure the government is doing right. It's so fundamental. Okay, so hold all the great questions. Julia, let's talk about a story you worked on. How many people in this room are a tech reporter or who have had a tech beat? You have to cover tech as part of your world, right? Tech's everything in California. Like half of the reporting jobs are on tech beats. So we don't often think about tech reporters being FOI experts, but it's very important to know where government intersects with tech companies. That's part of being doing your watchdog journalism. And Julia proved that with some court records we're going to get into. So will you please take it away and tell us about your Google search warrant project?
Sure. So in the summer of 2022, our newsroom at Bloomberg had a deep interest in exploring how tech companies' information was being utilized in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision overturning the constitutional right to an abortion. And the company that I was most interested in was Alphabet, better known as Google. And the natural place to answer this question of how Google's data might be used in potential cases against people seeking abortion was search warrants. Now, typically with a search warrant, law enforcement must identify a person of interest and explain to a judge why they believe that they have a good likelihood of finding information that indicating that a crime has been committed. But Google has so much data about us that this process is flipped on its head. Law enforcement can come to them when they don't have a suspect in mind and they're just scrounging around for leads. This happens in two ways. The first way is what's known as a reverse keyword search warrant, in which police kind of think to themselves, what's a phrase that this perpetrator might have used? Perhaps the address where a crime took place, the name of a victim, and they will go to Google and say, give me information about everyone who searched for this phrase in the days leading up to a crime. Now you can imagine why civil liberties advocates are concerned about the potential of those warrants in the wake of the Dobbs decision. The other main way this happens is with what's called a geofence warrant, in which police can go to Google and say, give me a list of everyone who was in the vicinity of this place where a crime took place within a certain window of time. And Google can also provide a list of everyone who has a certain setting enabled on both iPhone and Android, and most of us did without realizing it. And so we wanted to see how these warrants were being used. And we knew that the only way to answer that question was to obtain lots and lots of search warrants.
Let me ask you a question. You were a federal courts reporter. You covered legal affairs. You know your way around a courthouse. Was it easy to hunt down these state search warrants filed in state courts?
Sadly, no. I realized early on that Pacer was not really helpful for these cases. There weren't many of these warrants filed in federal court. State court was really where they lived, but that system is Balkanized. It's not just different state by state, it's different city by city, county by county. And so it felt like finding a needle in a haystack, but we just, fanned out to 5 different states. And each place that we looked was a little bit different. Arizona was a dream scenario. I was able to just walk into the courthouse in Phoenix, sit down at a terminal, type in the name of the company, and a list of hundreds of warrants popped up. I printed out the ones of interest, walked out with 300 pages. It was great.
I just interject. Who here has been to the Hall of Justice in San Francisco to look at search warrants? Yeah. Was that your experience, Alex? No.
Yeah.
And we're not going to pick on any one court staff or one system. It's really about just the wide range and what you need to do to be prepared, because there is a right of access here. So, okay, what was your experience with some California courts?
Yes. So I would say in the middle of the spectrum, North Carolina, they had a folder, just a plain manila folder with all the tech warrants that their clerk would group together. So that was kind of handy, less low tech, but made it relatively quick work. San Francisco was the most arduous place that we searched for warrants. We had to make an appointment with the clerk to even view the warrants. It took weeks to secure an appointment, and it's just a stack of papers with every single warrant that has been submitted in a given month. And I flipped through them one by one, identified the ones that had been submitted to Doodle, and then the ones that were relevant.
So I'm going to tell some tales out of school, but at some point, Julia called me. We worked together. I had the pleasure of hiring Julia to a newspaper when she was a cover reporter. And she was like, someone at the courthouse says these aren't public records. Is that true? This is not true, Annie. Can you just give us a little bit of framework about this particular court record in California?
Yeah. So, the Public Records Act, which we talked about a little bit before, does not apply to court records, but court records are presumptively open under the California Rules of Court and under the common law. So both in federal and state, there's a presumption that court records are open to the public. So they have to, if they want to seal records and keep them from public view, there has to be very specific findings, compelling reasons to justify the sealing for most federal documents. And in the state, there's an even more difficult standard of an overriding interest has to support the sealing, and the sealing has to be narrowly tailored to that interest. And things like that. So you are entitled to most court records, even though court clerks might not always know that, and even though it doesn't come from the Public Records Act.
That's right. And with SBJ NorCal's Freedom of Information Committee, we had actually had sit downs with this court staff. So it didn't surprise me that they told you at first, that anyone would say at first, oh, those aren't public records. But that's why we think it's so important, just as a reminder that there is this right of access, even though it is not necessarily a given, and it doesn't mean they won't be excessively sealed. So you did finally get your stacks and stacks of unorganized records. And did you get your Big Dobbs story?
Well, so spoiler alert, no. But we collected 115 search warrants. We poured over them, and we got to a point where we realized, it is very possible that law enforcement is using Doodle data in this way to pursue people seeking abortions, but we didn't find evidence of it. But what was becoming clear from our review of the search warrants was that there was another very important story to be told. And that was about how these warrants, which law enforcement has always framed as a tool to be used to solve the worst of the worst cases, was being used in everyday penny ante crimes, burglaries, a stolen crock pot, vandalism. you name it. It had become something that was reflexive for them. And these techniques sweep up everyone's data. And so the fact that they were using it for such small matters seemed very important to tell.
I feel like the first headline I saw was this one: police are requesting self-driving car footage for video evidence. So I feel like this was kind of a scoop.
It was, and I think the silver lining of my many visits to the San Francisco courthouse was that because I had to turn every page, I found some things that I wouldn't have found if I had been sitting at a terminal, and that included search warrants submitted to Waymo for footage captured by the self-driving cars. The car sees via cameras, it hears via audio. That data is collected, stored, it can be obtained by law enforcement. And so I found a pattern in which police was reviewing security camera footage, noticing a Waymo, passed by, and they were sending search warrants to Waymo and saying, "Oh, I would love to have this view of the crime that you captured." Well, actually, it was a demand, so it was not framed so conversationally. But yeah. So this was an unexpected scoop that came from turning every page.
We have a slide that just shows. These look like your routine search warrants packages. If you've never looked at one, we have some on our website because sometimes we have to investigate when they're used against journalists. So, an officer swears out under oath why they have probable cause to believe that something bad has happened. And they put a bunch of information in that. So you were getting these affidavits, and here there were some in the return, when they were done executing the search warrant, they had some photos showing like the autonomous vehicle out there. But this wasn't the only story. This was like the start. What was the bigger story that you ended up finding with these records?
Yeah, so I used this story to plant my flag on the issue, but all the while I was working up to tell the big story for Business Week magazine, which was the story putting all the pieces together, just showing this portrait that had emerged nationwide. And along the way, I created a little table where I was logging details of the warrant, and really the warrants were a springboard into different stories. In the case of the Waymo warrant, I was able to see the address where the burglary had been committed. I knocked on the door and spoke to the man whose apartment had been burglarized and asked him how he felt about this use of footage. And in the case of geofence search warrants, I was able to submit public records requests in Arizona to obtain police case files regarding the crimes at hand. I used those to identify people who had been questioned by police because the dragnet turned up their names, but they had nothing to do with the crime. In the most striking case, there was a drive-by shooting in a suburb of Phoenix late at night, and geofence data revealed, one device that was out and about on the street at the exact moment the shooting took place. But this was not the shooter. It was a retiree who was feeding stray cats in the neighborhood, and he was questioned by police. So it was just a very gripping example of how these dragnet warrants sweep up all sorts of folks. And I think really using the warrants as a springboard and rooting the story ultimately in human experience made it a much more compelling read.
So let's check out the next slide. This was the big piece. This had everything. The headline is pretty understated. Shout out to the editors for having a very careful headline here. But Google user data has become a favorite police shortcut. Tell us a little bit more about what you were able to put into context for people, and then the impact this had.
Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes in tech reporting, there's such an emphasis on scoops that sometimes we can lose sight of just all the room there is to show the full extent of something. Geofence warrants were a known phenomenon, so were keyword search warrants, and yet doing that careful work of collecting all the warrants, seeing how they were being used, seeing what the consequences were, that really moved people, even though this phenomenon had been known for years. And a couple months after publication, our reporting was cited in a ruling by the Colorado Supreme Court that was the first ruling nationwide on the constitutionality of keyword search warrants. And then 1 month after that, Google changed its policy. It changed the data that it collects with regards to location. So it is no longer capable of responding to geofence search warrants.
We've got a slide with that headline. I know. It's not, I'm guessing Google didn't call you up and be like, okay, Julia, you changed our whole policy globally. But as of right now, as we sit here right now, this is not happening.
I'm still checking to make sure, but to the best of my knowledge, I mean the data they have, police can still use. But
Right. Okay, so I know we have some tips and takeaways you're going to offer us, and I know folks are going to have a lot of questions for you. But again, we have another great presentation, and then we'll get into it. Give us some tips and takeaways that you have from this project or generally in your reporting.
The first would be don't take no for an answer. Although these are public records, you will have to get someone to give them to you. I befriended the clerk at the San Francisco courthouse, and she allowed me to review 4 months worth of search warrants at a time rather than 1 month. That greatly expedited my work, given that I was looking at 5 years worth of warrants. Also, look at the documents as a springboard, identify every name, every address. These are all breadcrumbs that you can find to tell the full story. And the last tip would be to note the patterns, stay organized, have a spreadsheet or whatever your organizational system might be, because you'll want to at some point pick up your head and take stock of the findings that are bubbling up.
Those are great tips. Okay, we're going to change gears. And
can I just add
yes,
one other point on this? So court records are presumptively open. Most court records, all kinds of filings, you should be able to access. Search warrants in particular have a little bit of nuance under state law, which is that the warrant is not a public record until it has been executed and then returned to the court, or until 10 days after the issuance of a warrant. So whichever is first. If they don't execute and return it within 10 days, you can get it at that point. But so for an initial period, they might legitimately be sealed, but don't give up. Like Julia says, go back in 10 days or once it's executed, and you can get that warrant. And that includes the entire warrant package, including affidavits in support, which is usually an officer setting out the facts of what happened. And so this 10-day rule / execution rule includes the affidavit, but the affidavit can be sealed in certain circumstances, like to protect.
You mean rubber stamped and always sealed in some places? Sorry.
Yeah, so that happens to protect the information about a confidential informant, or if there is official information, and preserving confidentiality outweighs the public's interest in disclosure, which is a mushy test, which means that some courts will always rubber stamp them and seal them. So sad. But there's precedent in California that you can push for redactions of the material that the confidentiality outweighs the interest in disclosure. But yeah.
What about this? Could Julie have just submitted a Public Records Act request to the San Francisco Police Department and gotten the full investigative package because the case was over? It was so old.
Unfortunately not, because California has what is called the investigative records exemption to the Public Records Act, which kind of makes investigative records a black box in California. There, we can talk about it more as we get further in, but
because of that challenge, it's often very important to know what your workarounds are, which sometimes means court records. Okay. Next, let's get into something that's important to parents and the public and everyone. And this is the safety and well-being of pupils and children in school and in college. Holly, you have made it a focus to cover some of the darkest stuff that happens in our schools, both K-12 and higher ed. And so I invited Holly here because there's always something we need to learn about the safety of our children in school. So that often means investigating teacher misconduct. And there have been a lot of blockbuster investigative reports that have come out about patterns, systemic issues with teachers at schools around the country, really. And some of Holly's stories really zoom into individual cases and provide what I will call a playbook that any local reporter could use to background a given teacher or school. So take us away. Give us your first example here you prepared for us.
Sure. Yeah, so the 3 examples I'm going to talk through are all examples where I've had success getting records of misconduct complaints. And I think there can be a perception that because these are personnel records, that you can't get anything. And so I basically want to say that I've had some luck. I've also had some setbacks and denials and so on. But these are examples where I did have success and did get records, which I do think reveal a bit about how schools investigate complaints. So this first example goes to San Jose. So I started reporting on a teacher named Israel Santiago who had been arrested, allegations that he had sexually abused 10 boys at a school in East San Jose. So that seemed like a high number. 10 boys, all, according to police at the time, in the band room, so at the school. So immediately that's a signal to me that I should put in a request to see if this goes deeper, to see if the school district had received previous allegations. So step 1, I started with a simple request: any and all emails, documents, or records related to complaints, reprimands, or investigations involving the teacher, Israel Santiago. And then,
and I think we have a slide that has some of then what you got back from the agency, but I know there was a pretty long delay. Walk us through what you did.
There was a delay of about 5 months, which seems to be the average. So essentially the district told me, like, we'll give you these records by this date. That date went by. So I said, hey, just checking in, see how it's going. And then this went on for a few more months until ultimately they did end up releasing records, which included dozens of pages related to past complaints of roughly a decade before this teacher had ever been arrested. So
show us the next slide, Joe, because we have a couple examples, not to move ahead, but yeah, walk us through some of what you got. Just after the big fight. I think we've got the next slide, Joe. Thanks. Sorry. All right.
Yeah, so I was able to get a few things, some which were just helpful for the reporting. So for instance, the district had shared the older investigative report of sexual harassment against this teacher. So it turned out about a decade before this teacher was arrested, there had been an initial complaint of inappropriate touching, and then I believe the year after that, a father had complained that his daughter was sexually harassed by this teacher, and the principal launched this investigation, talked to about 15 students. Most of the females in his class, almost all of them, reported feeling uncomfortable because of this teacher, and at least 2 of the students said that they felt uncomfortable the way he touched them, repeatedly asking for hugs, that kind of thing. And so there was this investigation. The principal ultimately found that it did not constitute sexual harassment, according to the principal. However, the principal said this was inappropriate and unprofessional and requested that he be transferred to a different school. And so 10 years later, that is the school where he was arrested for sexually abusing the boys. And according to the attorney I talked to recently, he believes at least 20 victims were involved because this teacher had been in the school district for quite a while, and he was transferred from one school in the district to another. So I got the investigative report, but I also got some things that were useful, such as the notice of suspension by the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, which is just useful to bolster your reporting, just showing that his credentials had been suspended, and then also Superior Court records showing the charges.
And this is a neat workaround. Sometimes I learned this from the lawyers at the First Amendment Coalition. So when I think I want my court records, I want to go down and anonymously sit at a computer terminal, and I just want to pull up my court records. They'll often submit a public records request if another agency that actually has to comply with the PRA has them, and you'll get them emailed to you, often much more cheaply than if you're buying court records. So I like to show that in this case, they turned them over. You weren't necessarily seeking those, but it came in your production, and now you have it.
Yeah, exactly. And we can go to the next slide of a different example that was very similar in the sense that, again, this is another teacher who had been arrested for allegations, in this case, of sexually abusing 10 of his students. He was an elementary school teacher. He was apparently beloved in the community for elaborate theater productions he would put on. And this reporting just took a bit more of a journey and had more than just records. So essentially, I had heard from a friend that this teacher, whose name was Brian, or his name is Brian Haug, had been essentially accused of like emotional abuse for some of his students. So bullying, ostracizing students, encouraging his students to bully other students, and so on. So a parent had set up a Facebook group because she said her daughter had been harassed, bullied to the point where she actually threatened to call the police in response to the bullying. So she had this Facebook group going where people were talking about past complaints they had made to the school, including this parent whose name is Jan Olson, who said that back in 2003, she had reported the teacher for bullying her son, that he had just deflated after that point. So this signals to me that there are perhaps records out there. I didn't know at the time sexual abuse allegations were reported as well, but bullying at least that seemed severe enough worth looking into and could paint a broader picture of how perhaps the teacher was allowed to get away with abuse. So we can go to the next slide. I put in a similar request, any and all complaints related to records related to this teacher. And initially, I got this record here, which refers to the bullying. So saying the teacher uses humor or sarcasm to create an environment that is perceived as unsafe, not consistently reviewing homework, those kinds of things. So this is not something that I'm going to write a story about necessarily. But it seemed like there would be more records than what the school was releasing. And then I remembered that the school had actually brought on a law firm to look into how they responded to the teacher over the years. And the law firm in their public report mentioned that there had been 3 previous complaints that, by the law firm's wording, were a semblance of unprofessional, and they were not the same complaint that the school turned over.
So it's a pretty good breadcrumb. So you're not going in looking for a needle in a haystack. You can do a little bit more targeted.
Yes, yeah. The more targeted your requests, the more luck perhaps you'll have. So I requested this time records related to specifically what the law firm was talking about. So these 3 complaints, and that is what the district ultimately turned over, I believe, a few months later. And the next slide is an example. And so, yeah, essentially, this is another example where parents had complained many, many years, I think about a decade before as well, about the teacher's conduct. In this case, 2 parents had reported that the teacher inappropriately touched their children. And the school responded by reprimanding him and saying to be more mindful to not touch students. He was reprimanded multiple times, which is another signal of perhaps the school's failure to adequately address complaints in the past.
And I know we have another slide that shows the headline. It's another understated news headline. But if you look at the story, it is not just about the court case. You dig in and you see Holly put so much context. She really allowed you to make judgments about whether the official response to these complaints was adequate. And it went way beyond what people were putting in the case at that time and what was coming out in court records.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was even, through that Facebook group, I mean, there was even like a parent that, was not involved in the lawsuit and who, or was not even mentioned the complaints of the records I was able to get. So yeah, there was a lot more. And for the parents who were concerned about bullying, they really felt that if the school had maybe taken those seriously, perhaps it wouldn't have escalated, or he would have at least felt like, okay, the school is paying attention. So it seems like even something like bullying is not something to overlook.
That's a great point. And I did ask Annie to weigh in a little bit here because you're making it sound very easy. Like you just got a bunch of records, case after case after case, right? What are some of the ways an agency may respond when you're making these kind of requests?
Yeah. So has anyone made a request for personnel records like this and gotten, oh, that's exempt, you can't get that, and are surprised that Holly got this? Yeah. So very common experience. So there is an exemption to the Public Records Act for personnel, medical, or similar files, the disclosure of which would constitute an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy of a public employee. So what that unwarranted invasion of personal privacy means is that it's a balancing test, and that the records need to be disclosed when the public's interest or they can only be withheld if the agency's interest in non-disclosure, aka the employee's privacy interests, clearly outweigh the public's interest in disclosure. So luckily, there's been some cases applying this, so it's not super mushy. And we have some guidance from the courts about when the scale tips in the favor of the public's interest in disclosure. So that is in terms of official misconduct. That is when there are allegations of misconduct that are substantial and there is reasonable cause to believe that those allegations are well-founded. So like Holly says, when she's seeing like a criminal indictment, that's a good indication that there's reasonable cause to believe that the allegations are well-founded. So if there was an indictment for official misconduct and then you get, oh, that's exempt from the agency, I would push back on that or write to FAC for your questions about that.
And that's huge because it's not like every time you put in a request, you're running this playbook of there's a teacher in the news, there's a lawsuit,
Right.
there's a case. It's not like every time they're turning over a tranche of documents and off to the races. So what do you do to be prepared then?
Yeah, I mean, so essentially, I mean, over the years of requesting these records, like I have reached out to the First Amendment Coalition and essentially have like the language on hand and ready, which is essentially making the arguments that were just mentioned as far as like these cases are in the public interest for the following reasons. And yeah, the case law, just citing it every time and having it ready to go. Yeah.
And FAC can help you with that. And I will also say that the higher ranking an official goes, the scale tips more towards disclosure, because the reasoning behind this is the public has an interest in assessing the efficacy of public employees because we pay their salaries and because we invest special trust and confidence in public employees, and we're interested to know if they're abusing their power. So for high-ranking officials, the cases about a superintendent, that if there are allegations of misconduct, those must be disclosed basically unless the allegation's completely ridiculous, like patently on its face must be false. So that's a little bit lower standard than reasonable reason to believe that they're well-founded.
But despite this fairly, it's not perfect, but a pretty good chance that you're entitled to some records when there's been certainly a finding against a teacher, principal, teacher of misconduct. You're finding that sometimes no one is asking for these records and looking at them in a systemic way.
Yeah, which is surprising. I mean, because in these cases where so many people are alleging abuse, I mean, 10 children for each of these arrests. I mean, why isn't everyone, not everyone, why aren't others like requesting records, or have they and they're just getting denials, or are they not following up? Like, I don't know.
Well, give us some of your trips and some of your takeaways here. We've got a slide for that.
Yes, yeah. I mean, so yeah, expecting the delays and the denials and being prepared with the language to assert the law.
Yeah, so we're skipping just a little bit
Oh.
of ahead, if that's okay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Keep going. Thank you, Joe. Because these are good. A couple more. We got a takeaway slide. Sorry to interrupt you, Alex. And we'll come back to some of that. Okay, some takeaways, because I feel like this is stuff you might get thrown on a school beat. You might be helping out. You might have to cover a school district. And so lay it on us.
Yeah. So being prepared for the delays and denials and the pushback, and having some language at your ready, so you can just like make the same argument every time, because you've seen how this goes so often. And then I definitely, with the delays are pretty common. So definitely being persistent and checking in, asking how things are going with your record requests fairly regularly, I think does help. Because the delays are pretty common. Yeah.
I know someone in this room would say that's because the Public Records Act is broken, but we're going to work on it. Okay. I know, but despite that, think of the successes that these three journalists have had. And I just want to take a minute before we talk about resources and get into Q&A to congratulate you all for performing these watchdog duties. And thank you for sharing these tutorials with all of us. Let's give them a round of applause. Let's take a minute to go over some of the resources that you mentioned, Annie. I think we've got, if anyone in this room doesn't already know, we have some free resources for you.
Yeah. So how can the First Amendment Coalition be a resource? I think we have another slide that has some details. So this is, we have a sample Public Records Act request letter on our website. So we were talking right before this presentation, like sometimes, if you're working with students, interns, whoever, or even seasoned reporters who haven't done investigations before, they might be intimidated by filing a Public Records Act request. Oh, there's all these, there's all this language you have to include and blah, blah, blah. But the law makes it very simple. You just have to reasonably describe what records you want. And FAC makes it even more simple by giving you all that statutory language that makes it even stronger. So
we're saying plagiarize. Let's just copy it off our website if you're not sure. If it's to California, your local agency, yeah. Or just say I want these under the Public Records Act, which is probably all I ever did. But
so you can just pull this language and describe the records you want. And we have some best practices for how to describe the records as particularly as possible. If you have reason to know a particular record exists, you can ask for it specifically. And
you're also a key part of our hotline. So I think
Yes.
probably half this room has actually talked to Annie on email at some point in the last year. Tell folks how the hotline works, then we'll jump into some Q&A.
Yeah, so we have a free legal hotline that's open to anyone who wants to write in, journalists, citizen journalists, anyone who you might be talking FOI with. And that comes directly to our legal team, so me or my supervisor, the legal director, David Loy. And we look at your question and we try to get you back a response as soon as possible. We try to keep that within a few days. We also prioritize urgent requests from reporters on deadline, so you can expect an even faster response if you mark that you're on deadline and let us know. We'll provide you, we can't provide specific legal advice or representation, but you let us know your problem. We can provide you general legal information that's applicable to your situation. So everything I've been kind of telling you guys today about this is what the personnel exemption applies to, and here are the exceptions to that, and here's when you should get disclosure, and here are those cases and citations for the statutes that say that. We'll give you all that general information that then you can use to go and be more empowered to push back on an agency's claim of exemptions or delays or anything like that, because you'll show that you really know what you're talking about by having these citations to authoritative law.
Thank you. Thank you, Annie. Joe, could we start some Q&A? You want to help get the mics out to the crowd? And if anyone has let our folks know watching on Zoom that we will take your questions via chat, and anything we don't get to that is substantive and about the Public Records Act, about court access, about maybe open meetings, you can write to the hotline. You'll get a link on email tonight and reach Annie directly. Okay, what would you like to do for, who do we have? Hey, I'm going to try to bring a mic around just because it's a crowded room. Thank you all for coming. And if you don't mind, say your name so we know who you are.
Hi, I'm E, and I'm with the California Local News Fellowship. Amazing. Holly, congratulations. This story about, so I used to teach, and so I'm very familiar with public school systems, and I see a lot of these things going on, right? And it's deeply disturbing to have suspicions confirmed. And so my question is, so this Santiago guy, there was a criminal indictment, right? That's a smoking gun. But what if a story comes and you're trying to pull personnel records for something where there is credible evidence that could actually be further corroborated by these records? Is there a way to pull them? Does that make sense? Does that question make sense?
You mean like before there's a case?
Yeah, like if people are coming, because actually one of the fellows actually did come and ask me about this, where rumors are swirling. I did tell her to look for Facebook or like social media groups and things like that, but there's all these stories. And the next step that she wanted to do was try to get these personnel records. But I think that sometimes in those instances, there are stories that go back decades. And is it possible to try to tip the balance if there isn't like an indictment where it's like, this is clearly in the public interest?
Love that question. Thank you, Ian. Thank you for coming. I just wanted, Holly and I talked about this exact same thing. Like, should you be probing around before there's a case or something like that? And
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I would say just put in the record request because, I mean, yeah, I've definitely gotten records when the teacher has not been arrested as well. Yeah, I've gotten records when teachers have been accused of harassment. If there's been complaints about the teacher in the past, which sometimes there haven't been formal complaints. So I would say just put in the record request and see what happens. It's not only instances that have led to an arrest, because oftentimes allegations are not reported to the police and there is no criminal case. But it sounds like if you have an inkling of people having known about this or being concerned for a while, then you have like a starting point.
Absolutely. And I wanted to give a shout out to a member of the Freedom of Information Committee with SPCJ NorCal, Matt Drange, who couldn't be here tonight, but has put up an invitation for anyone to look through his database of complaints that he's gotten about teachers all over California. So a little shout out there that someone has tried to amass as much as they could from sustained complaints. And so we can make that connection afterwards. Hey. Tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Mike Katzelkabe, and I think this question is probably for you, Annie. So I have a situation in which I know that the Police Management Association made a complaint against a police chief. There was an investigation done by an organization, and I have requested copies of both the complaint and the investigation, and they're being withheld because a peace officer is involved. And I'm wondering if there's any way around that, because I'm tired of repeated denials.
Yeah, so the personnel exemption that I discussed is for public employees generally, but peace officers do have a different set of rules. So this is for like teachers and other public employees. Peace officers, the records must be disclosed if there's a sustained finding of various forms of misconduct. That includes lying, and it includes sexual assault and false arrest. But there has to be a sustained finding. So that means that there had to be an investigation and findings made that found that the peace officer did actually violate their
Yeah.
rules.
1421.
Yeah, that's what year did that pass? Like 2021?
Yeah, 2019.
2019. Yeah, so before it's sustained, there is not an easy way around that. There's also if there was a discharge of a firearm that resulted in great bodily injury or death, that regardless of sustained findings, that is a public record that must be disclosed.
I think we hate giving this answer. It's one of the worst
Yeah.
answers we have to give about police chiefs because, right? I mean, we just did this training in Fresno where the city manager staged a press conference and said, we just investigated the chief and he's resigned. And we investigated him for abuse of power. But we found it was, he did not violate policy and it was for abuse of power. That's not one of the categories. And they paid a law firm $25,000 to do that investigation. And their question was, can we get the findings? And it's a sad answer, but workarounds, he can give it to you.
Yeah.
Because of abuse of power is not one of those.
I mean, yeah, abuse of power, it would be like a more specific type of misconduct, like lying or like, yeah.
More questions?
Can we take some from the Zoom real quick?
Yes, absolutely. Will you read them for us?
Yeah, great. So this comes from Pam Marino. I submitted a PRA to a university and was told my request was too much and would result in thousands of records. What is a good response when an agency balks at the size of your request other than narrowing that request?
Yeah, Annie, can you give us some advice on that?
Yeah. We were just talking about this before the presentation too. They can claim undue burden, overly burdensome as a basis to not respond to your records request. What I would do in that situation is start getting really specific. You can write to FAC and we can send you, our general legal information about what we would use in this situation. One of the big ones is that under the Public Records Act, there is a duty of the local agency to assist you in completing your public records request. And that includes they need to identify and provide suggestions for overcoming any practical basis to denying you the records. So that's really broad language. We can send that to you. You can quote it in however you follow up. But I would invoke that and then I would get really specific, asking specific questions. So, okay, it was 1,000 records. You can ask about how, so if they didn't give you a number, but that just said, oh, it was a large number of records, I would ask specifically how many, because they might say that it's unduly burdensome, but then the actual number is much smaller. You can ask how their search system is structured and kind of have a conversation about that so that you can drill down and narrow your request to fit how their system works, so it's not as burdensome. Sometimes even broadening your request can make it less burdensome because they don't have to like go in and extract certain data from a much larger database or things like that. So I would get really specific with the agency, ask the questions about how their files are organized, how they need to search, what you can do to narrow, like what would narrow the request to make it processable.
That's right. Plus,
yeah.
Pam, I think what Annie's saying is right to her, and she'll help you out with that. Because we've also seen people have success citing to the recent court cases while saying even like hundreds of thousands of records is not, if we're talking about emails, is not an
I also don't think 1,000 emails is, I don't think that would be burdensome personally, in my opinion.
New business coming in the door. Yeah, great question. And one more, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so this is from Wade Millward. For the panelists, how did you get editor buy-in or permission for your projects?
Candace, can I kick that to you first? But I think everyone should have to answer that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, 911 affects a lot of people, everyone. Public safety. So that one, that was quick buy-in. But also I did get some, even not pushback from my direct supervisor, but I did get comments of, but another station did that before. We've covered Oakland 911 before. So really going in was like the angle of, but I want to understand why it hasn't been fixed. Because some of these big issues, housing, public safety, yeah, the story's been done before. So how are you doing it differently? And starting with that has helped me.
And you've gotten good, I mean, you've gotten accolades for this particular project also. So clearly it's having, it's good for business.
Yeah, yeah, of course. But I would say, I did a panel recently about how the title is not, but it's sort of like, how did you win awards? And the awards I always say kind of just help with like, hey, let me keep doing this and have time and resources. That's a whole nother thing. But I find that that sort of recognition and comes with impact and accountability. So after the pandemic, a lot of because of faces, we got a lot of statements. We even got like recorded interviews because people are used to not doing interviews anymore because, we didn't see each other. And I was really tired of them. I went to my boss, no particular story, and I said, you know what? I am sick of written statements or no comments. If it's okay with you, and especially if the story warrants it, not every story, but most of them, especially with investigative, are you okay with me going further in saying, for instance, going to that city council meeting, going to that school board, going to appropriate places to get the answers in person takes more time and effort. But I really felt like when you took that extra step or 5 to get that accountability element, that really forget about the awards. It produced impact and change. It got more answers. And that's when really I saw our reporting, not just with 911, but really all our work really starts to turn the corner to do what all we want is meaningful, impactful reporting.
I would say for these stories, I think the 2 of them, I mean, I started them and was working on them without editor buy-in for a bit until I had enough. I think for the Los Gatos story, for example, like I did like interviews with probably 6 experts on sexual abuse and asked their opinion of the records I was getting to kind of say like the school should have reported this to these agencies. So I think for me, it was a matter of doing enough reporting that I can make the case that this seems to suggest systemic failure to the point that we should be reporting on this.
Yeah, and this is something I think about a lot. I think that time management is the biggest challenge for all of us and for our editors too. I'm a beat reporter, so at any given moment, I try to work on something small, medium, and large, something swoopy, to keep people happy.
Feed the
something,
beast.
something medium term that will be meaty, and then a big swing. I'll take a few of those a year, and my plans for each day often get thrown out the window with breaking news. But I find that by having that list, writing it each day in my notebook, it helps me, inch forward toward my goal. And with this search warrant story, it was as simple as just having that standing appointment at the courthouse in San Francisco once a week, going there, spending 1 hour. And that felt like an amount of time that was not hard for my editor to sign off on.
I think that's all really good practical advice. Joe, can I flip the script? Can I ask this accomplished audience what tips and tricks they have? Alex, you're a veteran editor. Jump in. What tricks and trips do you have for the room?
Full disclosure, you did ask me right before you asked me, and that's fine. I'm so happy to watch this because I just want to expand on some of what Holly talked about, if that's okay, because I was your editor on a couple of those pieces. I think that the San Jose example that you gave used a strategy that we try to employ, which is even though the California Public Records Act might be broken, there's a hidden lever in the determination clause of it, which I always try to point out, which is that when an agency has 10 and then they always extend it to plus 14 days to give you a response to your Public Records Act request that says whether or not they have responsive records, they are also required to say an estimated date that those records will be provided. I have had great positive success in always insisting that that estimate is given and then holding agencies accountable when they blow through it. I think that that can potentially turn your wait times down from several months to hopefully not much more than 1 or 2, because after you've gone to 2, hopefully you've caught the agency 2, 3 times and blowing past their own self-imposed deadlines, which is a paper trail for a successful lawsuit to enforce that they're not providing the records promptly. That's my biggest tip.
That's a great tip. Okay, what else from the room? If I want to over there.
Oh.
We'll take questions too, but give me your own expertise.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sarah. My question's for Holly. I previously interned for like Chalkbeat, so I have a little bit of like background in education, but like I found it like a really big barrier to entry. Public records only like give you so much information, and obviously in your stories, they've been very sensitive subject matters. I was wondering how you went along and how it went for you, like kind of integrating that parent community and like gaining that trust, especially into like Facebook groups when they're talking about like really sensitive stuff and they're worried about privacy, and just how did that go?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is interesting because I'm not sure if like the Los Gatos example, like these parents like really wanted like this known that the school in their words had failed like repeatedly. So I think one of the parents even shared that like a KQED reporter was interested in like hearing from more parents, and I did get more context that way. So I think in most of the cases I've reported on, like parents want attention on the school's failings to prevent it from happening again. So I think that was the case with these stories. I mean, even in the Los Gatos example, like parents were comfortable with their names, and they were speaking like in some of the cases their kids were now like in their 30s, like, but they didn't want to talk, but their parents like remembered this and like wanted to speak on behalf of their kids about what they had gone through. So I haven't encountered much resistance of like, we don't want you reporting on this or paying attention to this.
So I did a couple of similar stories, and then like fentanyl stories, talk about sensitivity, like their kid just passed away in a terrible way. And I don't know if this answers your question, but I feel like if, especially with those topics, if someone wants to talk, they want to talk. And if they don't, they don't. It was like a week after a 12-year-old, 16-year-old girl passed away, and the family was just, and I was like, they're never going to talk to me. You just never know. They're like, you know what? No, I've been trying to shout this by the rooftops. Thank you. I've been waiting for a reporter to call me. Or another one you'll call a year later and they're like, I will never speak about this. But polite, call them back in a year and even say, hey, I wanted to give you time. This is such an important issue. I explained to them why I want to do the story, and be genuine about it. I really hope that this doesn't happen to someone else. And also just like, hey, even if you're not ready to talk now, if you are, here's my number and email, because you never know in a year or so, like they're ready to talk about it. But I think the worst thing we could do is like force an interview on something so traumatic. And so if I say someone they don't want to talk, I'm usually like, okay, here's my number. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, that's great advice. What other questions? We got time for a couple more. Okay, question or advice?
Actually, can I ask two? Okay. Allie Brown with Bay City News. Thank you all for all the wonderful advice. The first one is a legal one, actually. For Annie, have you heard of the reverse CPRA lawsuits, and how concerned should we be?
Yeah, we're representing Holly in a reverse CPRA lawsuit right
good
now.
Lord.
What is that?
So if you submit a public records request to, for example, a school district, and I'm just going to give Holly's cases the example. So submits public records request. The school district says, okay, we have these records. We intend to disclose them, but they implicate this employee's personal privacy. So we're going to give him notice before we disclose them to you, and an opportunity to file a reverse PRA action, which is a lawsuit to to determine the public records rights and prevent the district from disclosing it. So we're in litigation over that right now. So in that case, that case is the employee who doesn't want the records disclosed against the district, who believes that it's their obligation to disclose it under the PRA. So it's determining whose argument is right under the PRA, and journalists can move to intervene in those cases to represent the rights of the public and the press to this information. And so we're representing Holly as an intervener in a case where one of these employees is trying to prevent disclosure of the records.
So if you weren't representing her, would she be held liable as the journalist?
No. So the journalist isn't, but she just might not get the records. So we're representing her interests to the extent that we want the district to disclose the records for the press and public. Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. No, yeah. And but the employee could have a legal right against the district if they disclose something that should be confidential. So that's what the lawsuits determine. So they're suing the school district. They're not suing the journalist. The journalist won't ever, yeah. Yeah, not in California. You won't get in trouble for accidentally getting, even if an agency discloses something to you that's completely illegal for them to disclose to you, it's not your fault. You won't get in trouble. But the agency might.
Yeah.
All right, we
I
got one
did.
from this side. Oh,
Oh, I'm sorry. I still have my mic. This one's for Candace. You had mentioned going to board meetings or city council meetings to raise your question, but what I've come across is that they cite the Brown Act and we don't have to respond during, because I would assume you would go during public comment that isn't regarding an agenda.
They can't answer.
Yeah, and they can't answer.
a
So
public
what do you do? Is it
So
just-
I only in my so we have only done that when we have reached out with our questions via email, calls, tried to in person. The public comment period is really last resort, because in my last interview for the story that I did where the director put someone's desk on a roof, but then he wasn't reprimanded because it was found, people believe he was best friends with the superintendent. The superintendent just not responding to but we established that in the stories. We have sent 12 emails. These are the very reasonable questions. And it's just, oh my goodness. Yeah. So you really saw that. So when I go there, so you actually hear a board member say, and we didn't take out we would never take out that, goes, we can't say anything. That's personnel, or this is public comment. And they're right. So I started by saying, my name is Candace Wen. I'm with NBC Bay Area. I am here today because I've sent these many emails and calls and we haven't received a response. So my question to you, superintendent, blah, 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 or city council or mayor, blah, 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 because it's not about the reporter. You never want to be part of the story, but a lot of times people want to see that question asked. It's not our question. It's the question for the public. So at least my thought is there is purpose for that question being asked in a public setting. And that was the last resort. I do think it's important to set that up of why you're doing it in that setting, because I do have a point of I can't talk about this. Well, you could respond via email. You could respond to my call. You could have told me out there in that hallway, but you didn't. So that's why I'm here.
That's a great point though. Question on that side?
okay. Here.
Thanks, Joe.
Hi, my name is Rick. I'm a freelance journalist, long active on Sunshine, and a little bit of advice. To the extent that your time and resources permit, familiarize yourselves with the Sunshine laws, CPRA, Brown, Bagley, Keene, so that if you go somewhere into a city hall, say, and you want a public record, and they try and withhold, you can push back at them and say, okay, well, under what specific provision in law? Well, I happen to know that what you're telling me is bogus. If they get a public record for you and want to charge you for it, for the search time, you need to know that they're not allowed to do that. There are, organizations like FACT, they put out guides and things like that. Familiarize yourselves so that on that spur of the moment occasion, when you need to push back, you'll have a basis from which to argue.
Well said. Thank you for that. We need to wrap up, but on that point, we do offer really detailed, in-depth PRA trainings. We have an amazingly generous legal team that will lead those and do those. Just reach out to me anytime when we can set those up. If you have specific questions, you want it to be confidential, you don't want to ask it in a room like this, write to our hotline. You can also ask me and I can help find someone who can answer your question. And with that, I would just want to take a moment to thank our panelists, Julia, Holly, Candace, and Annie. Thank you for your time. And Joe, will you give your closing remarks for us?
Oh, yeah, sure. Hey, everyone, thank you so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate you coming out and hearing from these wonderful journalists. But we all of our organizations also need your support. Bay City News, the First Amendment Coalition, and us at the Society of Professional Journalists. We can't do this without you all as either members or dues paying supporters. So please, our respective websites, please reach out, take a look, see if you can help, become members, become paying users, and all of that would help support the work that we do, the work that they do to help all of you get your access. So thank you again so much for coming out here. Thank you. Good night.